And thank you all so much for being here. It's an honor to be here tonight. And tonight I will be talking a little bit about the American Sublime and Anacapa Island. And to get us started a little bit, wait one moment. I'll be talking about what the concept of the American Sublime means in American history and aesthetic philosophy, as well as what it means in the context of Anacapa Island, which means I'll be talking about perceptions and representations of Anacapa Island throughout time. And then I'll talk a little bit about why those perceptions and representations matter for the way that we care for this island and the way that we act as environmental stewards for Anacapa Island. So to get us started, I'll do a very short summary of what the Sublime means. So in Europe, the Sublime started as a reaction in part to the Enlightenment, when people were starting to rethink the way in which they understood the natural world and their place within it. The preeminent scholar on the European Sublime, Marjorie Hope Nicholson, writes that before the Enlightenment era, the sort of most common perception of nature, and particularly challenging natural sites, places that are dangerous with large cliffs or waterfalls, places that we're worried about when we're in them. The prevailing perception of these places was called mountain gloom. So just gloomy areas with nothing worth noting, no reason to go there, just really terrible places you don't want to find yourself in. But as the Enlightenment began helping people rethink their place within that world, they started appreciating some of the more challenging aspects of these landscapes. And she calls that transition the transition from mountain gloom to mountain glory. And in mountain glory, you get the idea of the sublime. The sublime, as described by 17th century and a little bit into the 18th century European philosophers, is generally the combination of beauty and terror in nature. So one philosopher, Edmund Burke, describes this as terrible beauty, and he emphasizes pain and terror and horror. Most of the other philosophers aren't quite as dramatic as Burke is. Hugh Blair, for instance, focuses on grandeur and mighty power or force. Immanuel Kant focuses on how the sublime is an internal thing that a viewer experiences, as opposed to beauty being sort of more external. The sublime is something that you as a person are experiencing. Or for example, Schiller describes the sublime as actually being the internal triumph over your fear of nature. But the general points of the sublime to remember are that it is very, very different than the perception of beauty or the beautiful. My professor who supervised my research once described the difference between the beautiful and the sublime to me as the beautiful being a beautiful meadow with flowers, maybe a gentle rolling hill, nothing too challenging, whereas the sublime is a rushing cataract of water cascading down a huge mountain with rocks. It's beautiful, but it's also scary. It's inspiring fear. There's some danger involved and some negative words. Oftentimes the sublime will have these negative words like horror, terrible, awful. In connotation, those connotations also come up a lot. And one final thing also with the sublime, there's an entire area of philosophy that debates about whether or not the sublime can actually be applied to an object, meaning is something actually sublime, or do we just think it's sublime? I'm not going to get into that tonight. It's not very relevant to this talk. But the most important thing is that in what I'm talking about, a natural site is being seen as sublime. Within American history, the sublime has a slightly more recent history because it started in Western European philosophy and it took a while to gain traction here in the US. The earliest example of the sublime in the US is Natural Bridge, which is in Virginia and was most famously described by Thomas Jefferson. And it's a naturally occurring geological formation that looks like a bridge over a river. It's really astonishing and unusual looking. But this is an example of something that really wasn't accessible to much of the US. Mostly this was people who had access to the philosophical treatises being written by the Western European philosophers, and most of the US didn't have the education or the finances to do that. So it took a while for the sublime to become more of a popular notion And that was closer to the 1820s and 1830s, which was also at the same time as the rise of landscape painting in the US. So this is an example of a painter, Thomas Cole, who was very heavily involved in the Sublime movement within the US. And these paintings often reflected a lot of these same values of other phenomena happening at this time. So this was a time of expansion, of national exceptionalism, building within the US as it came into its own as a country, and it was trying to build its national character. And one thing that a lot of writers have noticed, writers of history and culture, is that the US often felt like it had something to prove in the face of Europe. Europe had all of these cultural monuments like the Vatican or all the places in Paris, all the places in London, all these amazing cultural sites, and the US felt like it didn't have anything to compare on that level. And as it started expanding towards the West, it started finding its monuments in nature instead of in quote-unquote culture. But one really important thing to mention in the context of nationalism and expansionism is that at this time the Sublime was not being used to justify environmental preservation or the halting of progression. It actually generally encouraged the exploration of these Sublime sites, and it encouraged the sort of touristic pilgrimages to these sites. And one of the best examples of that is Niagara Falls. Niagara Falls was an incredibly important and arguably the first of the most popular Sublime sites in the US. Niagara Falls really rivaled anything that Europe had to offer in terms of natural monuments. And it was also Niagara Falls that started the movement towards using the Sublime as a justification for environmental preservation, because Niagara Falls fell aesthetically. Niagara Falls was, in a sense, in many people's opinions, ruined by touristic and economic development. As people started visiting more economic development started occurring, more industrial development, including canals and trains, and Niagara Falls started to look a lot less natural, a lot less pristine, and even some European commentators started making fun of the US for not being able to take care of its own natural wonders. So the fall of Niagara Falls as this monumental site of grandeur and this sublime site that wasn't taken care of very well was very important to the transition of using the Sublime, not just to justify going to a site, but to justify preserving that site. So the next site that was essential in making the Sublime part of American environmental thought was Yosemite Valley. Yosemite was established as a national park in 1864 in the middle of the Civil War. There are a lot of different explanations of why Yosemite was established at this time. First, it wasn't actually a national park. It was a state park established by the federal government. Some scholars suggest that it might have been established as this park as a way to try to find a new Niagara Falls that the country could unite around in a time of such lack of union during the Civil War. Another suggestion was the increasing realization that not all sites within the US had a lot of economic viability, and that we should start turning worthless, and I do use the word worthless on purpose, it was often used to describe these sites, turn worthless sites into places of public recreation and aesthetic enjoyment. But Yosemite ended up going through a series of mismanagements that also needed to be corrected. And before I get to that, I just want to show you a few images of Albert Bierstadt, who was one of the most important landscape painters of the Sublime. Also, just because, interestingly, if you've ever seen Anacapa Island, his paintings of the Farallon Islands look an awful lot like Anacapa. So I just wanted to share that with you. So then the sort of pinnacle of sublime and monumental sites within American history was Yellowstone. This was when the first official national park was established in 1872 after mismanagement at Niagara Falls and at Yosemite. But one really interesting thing is that although this was another chance for sort of redemption on a national and international stage for the US, it was also within this category of assigning worthless lands to be public lands. There was a lot of debate at the time about whether or not Yellowstone should be put into public sort of preservation, and one of the reasons people didn't want that to happen is that they were worried they'd be losing out on the opportunity to gain economically from the land. And one of the main reasons it did pass as becoming a national park is that it was determined that it was an economically worthless area of land. And before I move on, I would just like to also mention that literature, in addition to art, was very important to the history of the Sublime. So if you've heard of Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, James Fenimore Cooper, many of these authors were also developing these ideas in tandem with painters like Thomas Moran and Albert Bierstadt. And all of these people helped contribute to a cultural imagination of what America's lands had to offer. But what does all of this have to do with Anacapa? It seems pretty removed. No scholar has ever described the Channel Islands National Park or any component of it as sublime. The most commonly described sites are Niagara Falls, Yosemite, Yellowstone, and Grand Canyon. So why Anacapa? If you've ever been to Anacapa, you might really be wondering that because there's not a lot on that island. And if you know much about the history of the park, you'll also know it wasn't established as a national monument until 1938, just way after the heyday of the Sublime in the 19th century. So you're probably really wondering why I'm talking about 19th century aesthetic philosophy. Well, I am arguing in the paper that I wrote for this and in a previous talk that I gave on this subject that the Sublime has actually been deeply embedded within perceptions and representations of Anacapa Island since the beginning of its descriptions in Anglo-American literature, news, and art. Anacapa, also within Channel Islands National Park, represents the site with the most potential to be a sublime site. With its craggy and volcanic nature, its arch rock, its sheer cliffs that anyone who has been on the island knows you're not supposed to get very close to, otherwise you might fall down them, with its history of shipwrecks, and it's just, in general, its dangerous atmosphere. Anacapa Island has all the dangerous qualities of the Sublime, but it also has many of the most iconic features within the park. So that's why I'll be talking about Anacapa Island. And I want to tell you that I planned on telling you when Anacapa might have started being seen as sublime, or when it stopped being seen as sublime, because I wasn't sure if it's still being seen as sublime today. But what I ended up finding after I went through newspaper after newspaper, and I promise you it wasn't through lack of reading many newspaper articles throughout time, Anacapa has been seen as both sublime and a worthless barren speck in the sea since the beginning of these descriptions. And the very first description was of a rather dangerous event because the Winfield Scott wrecked very famously on Anacapa Island in 1853. And this was the first US description of this island that I could find in any historical newspaper database. And there are many different descriptions, but this one I particularly liked, and I don't expect you to read any of these historical prints. They're very difficult to read, especially from afar. But this one describes the island as being in a dense fog, rocky and barren and desolate without inhabitants, and generally describes a very gloomy, foreboding island upon which this ship wrecked. So this was the very first entry of Anacapa Island into national history within the US as very much a mountain gloom site. But just a year later, famous artist James Abbott McNeill Whistler, who would go on to become a very famous artist in the US, was a young artist working for the US Geological Survey and was tasked to etch this very island 1 year later, and he got in trouble rather famously for right here. It's hard to see, but there are seagulls there. And as the US Geological Survey is about rocks and non-living features of islands, he was not supposed to include any living features and certainly not seagulls. We don't know why he did this. My hope is that perhaps upon visiting the island, Whistler realized that you can't depict this island without the shrieking gulls that make it what it is, for better or for worse. And he was compelled to include these birds as a sign of the vitality of this island. And a little bit of a hint of the sublime there, potentially. Then just a few years later, in 1864, Anacapa was described by another newspaper article as one of the most singular lumps of land in the world, with sharp precipitous sides that rise almost perpendicularly out of the sea. This is a very great example of the contested nature of Anacapa because it is at once most singular, which particularly for 19th century language is a very good thing. You want to be most singular, but it's also a lump of land. which isn't very positive in any vernacular. So it's already exhibiting this really contested nature, this ambivalence towards the island, both seeing it as incredible but also really unappealing. One of my favorite readings that I found in historical newspapers another decade later or so is this one, which is a first-hand explorer's account of the island. And I'd just like to point out that starting right here, going all the way to here is one sentence. Which actually is indicative of the sublime. Because many writers, especially in the Western European tradition, who describe their experiences can't stop talking about it. They keep rambling on and adding more things because it's so inexplicable and amazing that they just have to add another thing before they take another breath. So this extremely long sentence where he describes exploring Anacapa's caverns and going into gloomy areas with waves crashing and seals barking, probably sea lions barking, phosphorescent glow upon the ceilings, and how the other sailors are all afraid and superstitious and won't go in any further. This run-on sentence about this experience that he just can't stop talking about is indicative that he actually was really experiencing the sublime in 1877 when he explores Anacapa's caverns. So this is one of my favorite ones. And then moving past the 19th century into the 20th century, this contested nature of the sublime continues. This is a 1931 article from the LA Times called The Little Known Islands That Lie Off Our Coast. If you have very keen eyes, you can see that there are a lot of markings on this map, most of which are inaccurate. Most of the history the article goes through about the islands is wildly inaccurate. But one of the most interesting things is that the author describes the islands as beautiful, as having a Mediterranean climate and being like a Garden of Eden on Earth. But when he gets to Anacapa, he says that it is worthless, and Anacapa is bleak, of no value, and it is 3 islands of grotesque shape. And that's about all he says about Anacapa. So in this one, you can see that he has a very sort of pastoral image of what the beautiful is, but he's really not looking for the sublime. He's not looking for a more challenging aesthetic. He's not looking for the dangerous, scary island, and he really writes off Anacapa as just grotesque, as just bleak and barren. In the same year, another article is published calling Anacapa a barren isle and a dry, barren, lonely speck in the sea, and goes into its history of very dangerous currents and its history of wrecks. This one also exhibits sort of mountain gloom image of Anacapa without any sort of sense of it being a beautiful island. But in the very same year, famous Hollywood producer Cecil B. DeMille published an article basically arguing for appreciating challenging sites in nature. And he goes through 5 different places that he calls worthless, isolated, lonely spots throughout Southern California, one of which is San Miguel, where he starts the article, the others of which are then on the mainland, and then ending at Anacapa and his experiences diving at Anacapa Island. And he describes Anacapa as one of the most impactful places he's ever visited, particularly being underwater. He feels like he's experienced a whole new world and has experienced something really spectacular that not many people have the opportunity to feel. So in the very same year as an article calling Anacapa a barren isle and just specks in the sea, another writer was describing it as the most beautiful, wonderful, spectacular thing he had ever been to. But what's interesting about all of these is that they're all focused on aesthetics. But within the National Park Service, the focus in the 1930s really was not on aesthetics, but rather scientific and ecological value. This is a time of burgeoning understanding of the interconnectedness of different parts of nature, which eventually led to the field of ecology. And these quotes are taken from the 1933 report by a secretary in the Department of the Interior to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt about whether or not the islands should be recommended to be a national monument. And he did recommend that they be a national monument, but said that the scenery of the Channel Islands is not sufficiently extraordinary to justify classification as a national park on the basis of scenery. And pretty much just dismisses everything aesthetically about the islands, saying that the value of these islands is that they're in the ocean and that we need more oceanic representation within the Park Service, and that they have significant scientific value. And in the proclamation in 1938 by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the same emphasis continues. The focus is on the natural resources of the national park and on ecology and scientific value, and no focus on aesthetic value, which is particularly interesting when you start thinking back towards Yosemite and Yellowstone, where aesthetic value was of extreme importance in establishing these parks. They were sites of monumental grandeur, whereas Channel Islands National Monument at the time was a site of scientific value. But one thing that held consistent across these establishments of parks was that idea of the worthless lands. Anacapa Island and Santa Barbara Island were the two islands included in the National Monument when it was established. They also were the least economically profitable of all of the Channel Islands. So it fit within that sort of emphasis on islands that we won't gain from as much economically. And I'll just add that that also doesn't mean that the worthlessness angle doesn't negate the sublime angle. One of the sublime philosophers, Edmund Burke, actually argued that the sublime has to be of no use to man. That's where its value comes from. It can't be something that is providing a practical use to us. So that worthlessness is very important in this history. And then just a couple more examples after this establishment of the park. This one's pretty great. It also says, you don't land on this island, you board it. So this one is about a decade after the park was established, calling it a bleak rock and Siberia, but with charm. So this is again one of those examples of the contested nature of the island. The author clearly recognizes that Anacapa is a difficult place to encounter, but that it also has something of value. As he discusses from the quote on the right for you, that it almost seems overdone. There's so much there that you're encountering and feeling and hearing and seeing that you understand why someone else might not be as interested in it. This one is from 1980, the year that the park was established as the park we now know it as. And this article is in the LA Times and focused mostly on how dangerous and scary the islands are. It focuses on the rough seas, the swell, those sorts of things, and particularly for Anacapa, how barren the island is. And it also calls it the most inaccessible of all of the islands. But 4 years later, in the same newspaper, another author completely disagrees and describes Anacapa as the most picturesque island in the entire park. So this back and forth continues. And one of my favorite examples of the back and forth was that in 1995, a group of city council members in Ventura was described by the Ventura County Star as going to Anacapa Island on a trip. Some of those people, when they went to Inspiration Point, described it as $1 million view, saying that the whole trip was worth that view. Whereas others, including the then mayor, said, quote, "This will never rival Yellowstone or Yosemite, but there's enough to keep people coming." Which isn't exactly the most glowing recommendation of the island. And even within this article, there are a lot of examples of contested ideas about what Anacapa is like, even between the author and whoever wrote the captions. Because the author clearly agrees with the more, this is an amazing island sort of view, whereas the captions describe Anacapa as actually 3 specks of land in the ocean, harkening back to that use of the word speck in the 1930s. And then for just one quick example of a contemporary article about Anacapa, you can see that this back and forth perception of both the island as dangerous and foreboding, but also as beautiful continues in a rather gothic piece by a former park ranger turned ghost hunter, Andrea Langford, that focuses on the island and its eeriness, describing the island as having a horror movie-like atmosphere with shrieking gulls, like Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, and how the island, its name comes from the Chumash word for mirage or illusion, then saying that it's a splendid name for an island that likes to keep its skeletons in the closet, one of them quite literally, alluding to a suggested death that she says happened on the island that I wasn't able to find any historical evidence for. But this article is a really great example of one recently that continues this perception of the island as dangerous and foreboding, but also really intriguing. I would like to also mention a few other contemporary sources. I conducted 3 interviews for this research, and the first was with photographer Tim Hoff, whose work is used regularly by the park in its promotional materials and other places. And I talked to Tim a little bit about his experience of Anacapa. He said that with Anacapa Island, you really know you're on an island. You always have the ocean all around you. You never feel like you're on the mainland in a way that you can in a lot of the larger islands in the chain. Sometimes on Santa Cruz or somewhere like that, you can get blocked by the hills and not be able to see the ocean anymore. You can see ranch houses. But on Anacapa Island, you always see the ocean, you always hear the gulls shrieking, and you always hear the sea lions barking. And that really gives you this sense that you're in a very unique and different place than the mainland. But he also emphasized Anacapa's accessibility as an island and how easy it is to get around and how flat the island is once you get on top. Not the best image for that, which lessens its power and force a little bit. If the island's easily accessible and easily walked around, it's not quite as dangerous. So Tim expressed this sort of sense of the island being sublime and unique and very different, but also being accessible. And when I asked him what his favorite spot on the island was, he told me, obviously it has to be Inspiration Point. And he said that that goes without saying. He can go to Inspiration Point and sit there from sunrise until sunset and have photo opportunities that change constantly. So it goes on to describe the various different conditions that you can see at Inspiration Point and how incredible that can be to sit in one spot for hours and get so many different views and have so many different experiences without even moving. So I would say that Tim's perceptions of the island and his descriptions of it generally fit with an idea of the sublime, but also show that contested nature, that it's not all clearly one category or the other. Another artist that I spoke with is Ken Mcalpine, a local author who wrote a book in 2009, pre-smartphone era, as you can tell from the cover, about living on the islands for extended periods of time during a one-year period in his life. The project that he developed, which was to stay on each island for a week and then come back to the mainland and write about it. He said that it came from a place of feeling like modern life was sort of spinning out of control in his own personal life, and he wanted to get down to what really mattered, and that what better place to do that than the islands. And for Anacapa, sort of getting down to what really matters in a very Thoreauvian sense, getting to that sense of isolation and solitude was a lot more difficult than some of the other islands because it's so small. There's really not a lot of backcountry hiking that you can get into and escape through on Anacapa Island. So it was somewhere where he really had to work on solitude as almost a mental exercise. And one of the ways that he talked about this was that he was already nervous about camping on the island for a week when he first arrived, which is pretty understandable, again, if you have been to Anacapa and you know that you can loop the island in a couple hours or less. It's understandable to be a little nervous about staying there for a week. But he felt this really ominous feeling in his stomach as he approached the island on the boat, and it didn't go away when he got on the island, and it didn't go away as he was walking around. But on, I believe, the second night that he was there, he went out to Inspiration Point at sunset, and he suddenly understood what he was feeling nervous and ominous about, and that's that he was afraid of being alone. And suddenly he wasn't anymore, and he felt that he had an understanding of his place in the world while being at Inspiration Point and looking at this view. I would say what he calls a moment of epiphany is a moment of sublime, that he experienced the sublime at that moment in realizing and having this incredible, complicated emotional reaction to the landscape. And then one other thing that Ken told me about his experience at Anacapa is that it made him think a lot about humanity's place within nature. And he mentioned that it felt like Anacapa would have continued on without him. Not that we don't have an impact on places, but that the island made him pay attention to what mattered. And so while he was talking about this, he talked a lot about how that relates to his sense of stewardship, which I'll be getting to in just a little bit. I'm not sure. I don't think he did. And then the third interview I did was with a local Chumash elder, Julie Tumamai Stensley, because as I was going through this research, I realized that most of the newspaper articles I've shown you come from primarily white American men And I was realizing that I need more of a diverse perspective within this description, and that descriptions of Anacapa Island did not start with people who identify as US Americans, but have been going on for a lot longer than the US was established. So I talked to Julie a little bit about Chumash perceptions of Anacapa Island, and whether or not they can align at all with this idea of the sublime. And her response is that the sublime aligns very well with the sacred. And as she was talking about this, this is what she told me, that she gets back to the seasons, that there might have been a time in the spring, for instance, when the island woke up, that all of a sudden it becomes sublime because it's alive, even though it's already been alive this whole time. But the life and the subtleties of it make you realize how spectacular the island is. And that for her, she would describe that as sacred, and that aligns very well with the concept of the sublime. So this perception has been going on for much longer than just these American journalists describing it. And one thing she also added is that this perception of Anacapa also is very important to environmental conditions and respecting environmental conditions. That looking at Anacapa throughout time, there's been a lot of respect and fear of the island for recognizing that it can be very dangerous to navigate around, and that weather conditions around Anacapa can tell you a lot about weather conditions throughout the entire area. So as she talked about this idea of sort of the fear and respect of the island, that for me also very much connected to the sublime, because for most of the philosophers writing about it, the fear of something also engenders this sort of respect for that which you fear. Very quickly, I'd like to go into some of the park's own materials and whether or not they align with the sublime. So the first example of that would be the park film. And this one opens with images of Anacapa Island with the foghorn blaring, seeing the lighthouse at night, and eventually the music swells and lands on this image of arch rock. So both of the primary images within the very beginning parts of the film focus on Anacapa Island as the sort of icons of the national park. And throughout the film, we see Anacapa during cuts to, during voiceovers by Kevin Costner talking about places of refuge and inspiration, of restoring the spirit. Anacapa repeatedly is used to symbolize those ideas and those concepts. And one of the strongest areas that I see that happening is that in the ending part of the film, the narrative talks about vistas to be discovered, a shot to Anacapa, jagged beauty, a shot of Inspiration Point, calm restoring the spirit, the cliffs of Anacapa. And there's finally an appeal to stewardship, which again focuses on Anacapa with this shot of the fog rolling over the cliffs. And it ends with a quote calling the Channel Islands an island world, a wilderness shimmering on the horizon. And their image for this is panning out from Anacapa to view the entire island chain. So throughout this movie, the sublimity of the islands is primarily depicted through Anacapa, at the beginning of the film, throughout the film, and at the end. So not only is Anacapa depicted as sublime, but Anacapa's sublimity stands in for the sublimity of the entire national park. Other materials in the park also use the same imagery, from the brochure to the website. I'm sure if you look at any of the brochures you might have right now, you'll see Inspiration Point over and over as the symbol of the entire park and its sublimity. So, again, you might be wondering, why does all this matter? Why does it matter if Anacapa is seen as sublime or if it's seen as barren? And I would tell you that perception and representation matter so much for stewardship. They matter for how we care about places and for how we protect places. And before I tell you more about that, I would like to acknowledge really quickly that there are issues with the sublime historically. The sublime has had many, many cultural and environmental problems throughout time. It has been used to justify the erasure and removal of Native American peoples from their lands by promoting the idea that these lands are uninhabited wildernesses of pristine beauty just waiting to be settled. It has focused on sites of monumental grandeur instead of prioritizing sites of ecological value or other values. It has also not been fully democratic and has often been a concept that has only afforded recreational and aesthetic opportunities to the most elite within American society. It also has been a highly gendered concept that prioritizes men over women throughout time. If you think of a lot of the people whose quotes are often used within the context of the sublime. Thoreau, Muir, Emerson. They're often very male voices, and a lot of times the female voices have been very silenced throughout time. And then finally, the sublime, one of the main critiques of the sublime within environmental studies is that it's often been used to legitimize domination over nature. And the reason I chose this image right here is it kind of talks about all of that, because there's a blonde, very well-dressed man standing physically over nature. So I just want to acknowledge that those problems exist and they shouldn't be ignored. But I would also argue that the sublime is not a concept that should be put on the shelf and ignored, because there are very valuable parts of it, primarily because it expands the mind and it feeds the soul in the way that Ken Mcalpine described on Anacapa. And it's also a very, very malleable concept. The very fact that no one seems to agree on what the sublime is, or on what the definition of the sublime can be, means that we can define it as we want to. So we can take the good parts and move on from the bad parts. One of the really valuable parts of the sublime is that it focuses on the intrinsic value of a site. Intrinsic means inherent and non-utilitarian, so not on what sites have to offer us, but what they have just inherently within them that's valuable. The sublime values the experiential value of a place. It values that place just for existing, just for being as incredible as it is, not for anything else that it offers us. And an environmental ethic based on intrinsic value, particularly in the context of Anacapa Island, is much stronger than one focused on utilitarian value. As people have found out throughout time, as they've tried to make Anacapa Island an economically valuable enterprise, it's not going to happen on that island. There's no fresh water. There's a rumor that when there were sheep for ranching on the island, the sheep had to lick dew off of each other's coats to have enough water. It's not going to be an island that's going to be economically valuable in the same way that many of the other islands potentially could be, or that other sites could be. So for Anacapa, that sense of caring about the island and protecting it has to come from somewhere else. And I think that these intrinsic and aesthetic values have a lot to offer us for that idea. And one person who I look to for this is famous conservationist Aldo Leopold, who developed the idea of the land ethic. And he writes that any system of conservation based solely on economic value and self-interest is hopelessly lopsided, as I've suggested. And he instead emphasizes the interconnectedness of ecology and aesthetics to create what he did call the land ethic, what we would now call an environmental ethic. And he notes that this is not an easy fix, that changing perception, changing representations, changing the way that we think is a very difficult thing, but it's also a very necessary thing as we move forward into the future. And one of his most famous quotes about this that I would like to share with you is that a thing is right when it tends to preserve the stability, integrity, and beauty of the biotic community. And I would like to suggest that maintaining sublime perceptions of Anacapa can do just that. So although the sublime has all these issues, it also suggests a lot about the intrinsic value of Anacapa, that there's something that draws people to this island other than its utilitarian values, that there's something aesthetic and environmental and ecological about this island that is truly remarkable. And several philosophers suggest that the sublime really can help us see these things, that it helps jolt us out of our typical thinking, that it helps us challenge our preconceived notions about what a place is like or what we think of a place. So I would like to suggest that seeing and representing Anacapa as sublime avoids the common assertion that Anacapa is a barren wasteland. Most of us, myself included, are probably guilty of thinking from time to time that it's a completely worthless island. There's no reason to go there. It's covered in bird poop. The coreopsis looks dead for most of the year. It's a difficult island to deal with, but the sublime incorporates Anacapa's bleakness and its darkness and its gloominess and its desolateness into its wonder. Seeing Anacapa as sublime places intrinsic value on this island. Perhaps the comment that Anacapa will never be Yellowstone or Yosemite is accurate. It's not as picturesque as those places, but perhaps the very fact that it's picturesque is what makes it all the more valuable. It's harsh and dangerous and difficult, and it's an island with its own story. by combining an understanding of Anacapa's ecological importance and perhaps less than obvious aesthetic importance. Channel Islands National Park and other actors like the writers and journalists and other artists I've talked about tonight, they begin to appreciate Anacapa Island on its own terms, to develop a more holistic environmental ethic, and to inspire the public to care about this lonely speck in the sea. Thank you. So I would just like to quickly do a round of acknowledgements to the many, many people who made this project possible, including my research supervisor, Yvonne Menard, Chief of Interpretation here at Channel Islands National Park, Lauren Boros here at Channel Islands, my interview and research consultants, other people at Carleton College, Channel Islands staff and volunteers, and my family. And for questions, I'm just going to put up my favorite photo from all of my archival research. This is from Anacapa Island in the 1950s, and that's a Coast Guard member with his dog at Inspiration Point.
Well, thank you so much, Anna. Let's give Anna another round of applause for her amazing speech. I think that you've helped all of us care a little bit more about that speck in the sea, so thank you. And just to remind you, I'd like to ask that you wait until I come to you with the mic before asking your questions so that everyone is able to hear. So with that, if anybody has any questions.
This is more of a comment than a question, but Anacapa is a terribly important historical island in terms of ecology. It was West Anacapa where we discovered DDT's problems. It's the ice plant and that whole removal process and the challenge of trying to restore the island. And there's so much life out there that's unseen. Little butterflies and moths and birds that are hardly noticed. Anyway.
I completely agree with that. That's actually something that Ken Mcalpine talked about a lot in his interview with me, was that being on such a small island and not being able to go on these long hikes, those were the sorts of things he focused on more, were the little things that otherwise he wouldn't have noticed. And I would say that the Sublime doesn't have to be experienced just at these large monumental sites, and that it can be experienced on that level. And that also, one thing I would add is that I don't think the Sublime should be used on its own to develop an environmental ethic. I think valuing things like the scientific history of the island, its ecological importance for bird nesting and other scientific processes is also essential to developing a more robust environmental ethic. Thank you for your comment.
In looking at those landscape artists, the Hudson School, and how they glossed over kind of the problems and painted beautiful landscapes, I think they were trying to move beyond the aesthetic and connect on a very visceral level to make people kind of touch a higher version of themselves in making that connection. You see that with this island too, in terms of that visceral connection that people can have?
Absolutely, I would agree with that. I think the Sublime, interestingly, is often almost more about that than the beautiful is, of that it gets almost into psychology sometimes, about being so much within your own reaction to it. And many of the articles that I read about Anacapa Island, people sort of described this very intense internal process and reaction to the island. So I'd say that that's definitely something that's been going on with this island as well. Yeah. Or microphone. Getting your work out.
I think this is a wonderful show of what it's important to us, but in terms of our national parks, but kind of like just what I want to express, I think this is missing, not just in your presentation, but even in some others. It's like Teddy Roosevelt was a hunter, but he knew the Sublime, and he's the reason he saw it, and he said, okay, he's one of the big movers for our national parks because of that. The same with Anacapa and related to the fishermen who went out there. And a lot of them were immigrants, like the Shumash you spoke of, that this was a place they visited. They didn't live there, but they had reasons to go there for economic value. Well, fishermen's mostly of immigrant background, they felt this was a sublime area because this area, during the time it was made a national park, was the mainstay of the biggest fisheries in the world. And a lot of those fishermen, they look at this and they have a definition of sublime and the beauty that is not heard. It's not spoken by anyone. You said it's spoken by the elites, but luckily we had a hunter named Teddy Roosevelt that could explain what hunters saw in the sublime. But we don't have these immigrant fishermen explaining that in any of these stories, even in the west of the West that we have. That's my opinion anyway.
Well, I would say that is one of my main issues with the historical record, and why when I went back to do more research on this, I started seeking more alternative viewpoints and more literature on sort of the ethical connotations of the sublime. Is that the first time I did it, I was realizing how limited the perspective was within what was actually being recorded and documented in newspapers in the 19th century and the 20th century. Certainly it's been limited to whose voice is being listened to, and that's definitely something that needs to be worked on.
And that's that. I looked up the definition of sublime before we came over here, and it talks about the spirituality of it. And I believe that Anacapa has that because it's so small and you're up on a plateau, you're part of the sky. So you feel like you're really connected to something, to the entire world, because you can see, forever. And the sunrises and the way the clouds come in and the fog wraps around the island sometimes. I mean, it's really amazing.
Absolutely. That's a good way to put it.
It's like a spirituality.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hello. I was wondering, I became curious in this, the difference between visiting a place and viewing is interesting to me because like when you talk about inspiration point, people aren't really being inspired by their feet being on the ground, they're inspired by looking out. Like, what do you think about like the sublime and like being versus viewing?
That is one of the most interesting areas to me, and where a lot of the literature within cultural studies exists. So I think that the view is probably the most important part of the sublime. I think that the vista effect and how far you can view and how large the sort of caverns that you see or the mountains or the waterfalls or whatever the features of the site you're seeing are probably the most important aspect. Other sensory details are also important, but that view is incredibly important. But one area within the scholarly literature that has a lot of contestation is sort of two levels about expectations and photography. So there's a lot of literature about what happens to a sublime site when you've seen tons of pictures of it already. When you go to Yosemite to see Yosemite Valley, but you've seen a million photos of it anyways, and you get out your cell phone to take the same picture, is it the same effect as if you had planted your feet there without having seen it the first time? And then another issue within the literature would be then also your expectation of having a sublime experience when you go to a place. So it's connected to that sort of photography and replication. But can you have that sublime experience when you're expecting to have it, or does it have to be unexpected? I think those are all really interesting questions, and questions that, particularly with digital media, will become increasingly important with visitation to parks. But that's a really interesting issue to consider.
Further questions? If everyone can join me one more time in thanking Anna for coming tonight.